during this time. I'm Elizabeth Wetmore, and I'm so happy to be here with my friend and fellow writer, Christina Baker Kline, live to talk with you about my new novel, Valentine, which is also the latest Barnes & Noble Discover pick. I know that for me, during this difficult time, books and music have really been a great comfort. I hope a good book can be a little bit of comfort or an escape for you during this challenging time. And we're looking forward to discussing this one with you tonight and answering some of your questions.
I'm so delighted to be here. I love this novel, Valentine. I'm so honored to have been asked to do it with you, Beth, and I can't wait to ask you some questions in a few minutes.
Thank you, Christina. So one of my favorite parts of writing Valentine has been making up some tall tales to include in some of the characters' stories. It is, after all, a book set in Texas, so you got to have tall tales. And I'd like to read one of those to you tonight. All you need to know is that the person telling the story, the character telling the story is Deborah Ann Pierce, age 10, and she's telling the story to her friend, a young homeless man. But it's a story that her mother, Jenny, used to tell her before her mother left town without her daughter. So at the end of the story, there's a little point of view change, which you won't be able to see. So when you hear the line, and Deborah Ann closes her eyes, that's the signal that we've shifted points of view to her memory of her mother telling the story. There was this old rancher's wife who lived down by the Pecos River, she tells him, back when they still ran sheep in this part of Texas. She was a beautiful woman with hair so thick and red that when she stood in the sunlight, she sometimes looked as if she were on fire. But she was unlucky. A blizzard came up suddenly while her children were out riding fence with their daddy, and they all froze to death. The searchers found the children in a dry wash, huddled together with their horses. Her husband was just a few feet away with his head resting against the barbed wire fence the woman had helped him build just a few weeks earlier. For 3 years, nobody saw her. She didn't come into town, not even for coffee or cornmeal. The station master kept her mail in an old wooden crate behind the counter at the depot, and although a few men sometimes talked about going out to check on her, nobody wanted to interfere with her grief. And besides, it had been a bad couple of years. They all had their hands full with the big die-up and the ban on Texas cattle, and anyway, they figured she was probably dead. Finally, somebody got the idea to draw straws and send the loser out there to cut her body down or pull the buzzards off her bones. But when the 16-year-old boy who drew the short straw arrived at the woman's homestead, he found her very much alive and working in her garden. She was bony and sunburned, and her hands were covered with scars and sunspots. Her eyebrows and eyelashes were so sun-bleached they were practically white. But what a garden she had. The boy had never seen anything like it. They hadn't seen a good rain in 3 years, but the woman had plants growing out there that nobody had seen since they left Ohio or Louisiana. Peach trees and ropey cantaloupe vines, corn plants and tomatoes. There was honeysuckle below her kitchen window, and one corner of her garden had been planted with wildflowers. Hummingbirds drifted from blossom to blossom. The boy stared and stared, trying to figure it out, and after a while he noticed a deep trench running between her garden and the Pecos River. All by herself, the woman had changed the course of the river. She sent him back to town with 2 baskets, one filled with melons, the other with cucumbers, and anyone who happened to be standing around the depot when the boy returned shared in a spontaneous and joyful feast. One man got out his buck knife and sliced up all the cucumbers. Another one fetched his machete and split the cantaloupes in half, then quarters. The men scooped out the tender orange flesh with their bare hands and ate until their chins were sticky and their shirts were soaked through with juice. They feasted. And for a while, everyone admired the woman for her green thumb and her fortitude. How was it possible to have such a garden out there in the desert? One night, while the men were sitting around the depot drinking somebody's homemade whiskey and enjoying a basket full of peaches the woman had sent into town, one of them joked that maybe she was a witch. Maybe she had cast a spell and changed the direction of the Pecos River. Or maybe she dug a trench, one old man called from his table in the corner. But he was a known liar and lunatic, and nobody listened to him. Months passed, and each time a man rode out to check on her, the woman sent a basket of fruit and vegetables back to town with him. And then, predictably, there was an influenza outbreak. Predictably, asked Jessie. His voice is hoarse and low, nearly a whisper. Yes, Deborah Ann says, that is the exact word my mama always used. Predictably, Jenny would say, and she meant that every tall tale has to have some kind of calamity. And because the men couldn't believe it was just bad luck or their own stupidity, they started looking for someone to blame. How could a woman grow such a marvelous garden all by herself? How could she change the course of a river? How could she bear to go on living without her husband and her children? Any self-respecting woman would have killed herself, one man said, or at least gone back to the Midwest. When several babies and young children fell ill and died, the woman's fate was sealed. If she was bringing death to their offspring, 5 of the town's men decided they wanted to see it for themselves. They'd started drinking before sunset, and they were all about half stupid. They left the depot after midnight, and bad luck struck almost immediately. One man was so drunk he fell off his horse, struck his head on a rock, and choked to death on his own vomit. One wanted to take a detour and show the other men the strange pockets of gas between rocks where you could toss a lit match and watch the flames dance across the stone. But more gas than he expected had gathered in the crevices of the rocks, and he was consumed with fire. This left 3 men riding out to see that poor woman and ask her if she was a witch. When a sudden thunderstorm came barreling across the land as if summoned out of nowhere, one man and his horse were struck by lightning. When one of the 2 remaining men tried to save him, not one of them was smart enough to understand electricity. He too died. And so, after that, only one drunk, scared, and angry man made it to the woman's door. And do you know what happened? DA pauses. What happened? Jessie's voice is so quiet she leans forward and repeats the question. Do you know what happened? What happened? He sounds as if he is trying to speak louder, but it's a sad effort, and Deborah Ann wonders if her friend is all right, if the heat and loneliness and living out here have worn him down, if maybe she's not enough to help him get back on his feet again. Well, she says, the man knocked on her door, pounded on it really, and he was hollering at her to open this goddamn door. What happened to her? Jessie asked quietly. Something bad? That is exactly what I used to ask my mom. What did your mother say? Jessie wants to know, and Deborah Ann closes her eyes. Her mother pauses and stands up from DA's bed, then walks over and picks up a pile of clothes off the floor. The woman picked up her lantern and opened her door, Jenny says, and in the flickering yellow light, her hair looked like a fire burning. Deborah Ann can see the circles under her mother's eyes, the fingernails she's chewed to the quick. What did the woman do next? Jenny laughs quietly. Well, she shot him on the spot and dragged his body to the edge of her property. She walks around to DA's bed and tucks the blanket around her legs and arms. After that, nobody bothered her much. The woman spent her days working in her garden, though she never again sent baskets into town for the men to enjoy. Evenings, she sat out on her front porch and watched all the stars come out one by one. She lived to be 105 years old and died peacefully in her sleep, and by the time it occurred to anybody to ride out there and check on her, she was nothing but a pile of dusty bones in her bed. And her garden, Deborah Ann asked her mother, what happened to that? I guess it probably died, Jenny shrugs, but it was remarkable while it lasted.
Oh, Beth, oh my goodness. That is such a perfect excerpt to introduce people to your novel because, first of all, it's a story within a story, but we know we can tell that you're a master storyteller. It's got magic, poetry, the vivid language, even humor. And I was thinking about, as you were reading it, I was thinking about something that one of your Goodreads reviewers said. I was looking through those today. She said, I can taste the dust in my mouth and smell the oil on my skin. And I really wondered whether you have ever studied poetry. Your writing is so poetic. Your images are so vivid. How do you get that vivid, visceral language?
I don't write poetry. I've tried a few times and it's always awful, but I read a lot of poetry. I love reading poetry, and I'm firmly convinced that every fiction writer should read a lot of poetry. So I suppose that's where it comes from.
Are there any favorite poets you could mention?
Oh gosh. Well, I love Larry Levis. He gets the epigraph. Right now, I'm reading this beautiful book by Tiana Clark. There it is. I can't talk about the trees without the blood. It's beautiful. And yeah, Elizabeth Bishop is a favorite. Gosh, this is one of those questions that if I weren't on the spot, I could think of a million of them. But yeah, Elizabeth
But
Bishop.
you can feel that in the veins of this book. You've got
Mhm.
this incredible balance of a gripping, thrilling story that has this forward motion and this language that makes you want to stop and savor it, which is a really unusual combination. So what was the spark for you of this novel? What are the origins of it?
Well, I spent a lot of time as a little girl eavesdropping on the adults in my life, sitting out on the back porch after supper, listening to my mom and her girlfriends or the neighbors talk about their lives, and some of the men in my life as well. And during oil booms, I would listen to them talk about how good things were. Most of the people I knew growing up were people who worked in the oil patch, hauling pipes or working on rigs. The women I knew worked in industries that supported the oil patch, waitresses, bartenders, preschool teachers, that sort of thing. And so during oil booms, I would listen to them talk about how good things were, how people had jobs and work and were saving a little money. And during oil bust, I would listen to them talk about whose house had been foreclosed upon or who had lost their job and was leaving town. There's a joke in that part of the world that during an oil bust, the only person in town making any money is the U-Haul guy. And so I really took in those stories, and I really carried those voices with me once I left home. And I think I started the book with those voices. And then, of course, draft by draft, the fiction kicked in, right? And their stories kicked in. But those voices were really where I began.
Yeah, the voices are so distinctive. You've got 7 different characters. They come in and out, and together they tell this beautiful story. This is a novel about Texas and about your Texas hometown. I was watching the Today Show this morning when Jenna, the Jenna's pick, when Jenna noted that as a fellow Texan, she felt intimately familiar with the place you were describing.
Mhm.
So you write intimately about cowboys and poverty and desperation. What pitfalls did you have to avoid, or cliches about the place, and how did you pull that off?
Well, it took me a long time. I left home when I was 18. I'm 52 now. This is my debut book. It took me a long time to be able to write this book. And I think a big part of that was one of the things I learned very quickly when I started writing the book was that growing up in a place doesn't mean seeing it clearly,
Mm-hmm.
and hearing these voices of these women and girls did not mean that I understood them in the kinds of complicated and nuanced ways that they needed as fictional characters, to have their stories told. So it took me a long time and a fair amount of living, I think, on my own. Becoming a mom really changed things for me. I suddenly saw these women's lives in a completely different light and was able to, I think, maybe for the first time, understand some of their sorrow and their rage and their love for their children, and their struggles and their joys, of course. And so, yeah, it took me a long time. Some of the pitfalls, I guess, are probably a lot of the pitfalls with writing a book set in the South or any sort of landscape that kind of looms large in the imagination, but maybe a lot of people aren't terribly familiar with it. And that was just, not being reductive. My hometown's a complicated place with deep social ills, particularly during an oil boom. And at the same time, it's also a place filled with people who are just trying to keep a roof over their heads and raise their families, So
Right.
it's hard to be careful.
Yeah, your characters are such individuals that it never feels that you're condescending to any of them. There's this sense that they all have stories in their past that explain who they've become, and it's unusual. I think the sort of granular detail of the depth of feeling that we have finishing the book. And as I say, I was reading your Goodreads comments, and I was struck by how many people felt personal connection. People who've never been to said they had never been to Texas or knew people like, but felt that you were describing these characters in such a way that they understood who they were. Really hard to pull that off. Yeah.
Well, and of course, you're never thinking of things like theme or what you're trying to accomplish when you're writing the book. I mean, for me, when I'm writing anything, I'm just trying to survive to the next paragraph. I mean, honestly, but there was definitely a moment in the final drafts where, it became important to me to be mindful that probably a lot of people who are reading my book would not know that part of the world at all. And I very much wanted people to care about that part of the world, particularly that landscape. I've lived in Chicago for 18 years. And here in Chicago, a lot of my friends, when they hear the oil and gas industry, they think of the big oil execs, and that's true. But those aren't the people who are of interest to me. The people who are of interest to me are the people working in the oil patch, And so on the one hand, I wanted their lives to be illuminated. And on the other hand, I also wanted this land to loom large for people and to be a place that people thought about in terms of being worth saving. From the environmental degradations of fracking, for example, and so I wanted the land to be thought of as valuable and worth saving in its own right.
Yeah, the land is a character in the book.
Yeah.
And you do feel that very much. It's sort of has a mythic quality to it. So you mentioned in an interview somewhere, I think, that you started writing in your mid-20s. And you're now, as you've said, 52. This is your first novel. Congratulations.
Thank you.
To have such a splashy debut is very exciting as well. And of course, everyone does, every first novel, right? I mean, so it's a wonderful thing that's happened, but you said somewhere else that it took you 14 years to write this. So it was chosen as a Barnes & Noble Discover pick, which is the most exciting thing. I got that with my first, I don't think I was the pick. I think I was a finalist for my first novel, but it was a very wonderful boost. And I wanted to ask what it feels like to have that boost, but also then to talk a little bit about this long journey.
It's remarkable, and I was obviously surprised and thrilled, and I feel incredibly fortunate. This is a bad time to have a book coming out for anyone, and I'm incredibly mindful that there are a lot of people whose first books are coming out right now, who were really depending on their book tours and readings to sell books. Particularly, I think of people, for example, who have collections of poetry coming out, so I'm delighted and thrilled. And of course, I mean, it's always a good thing to have as many people as possible reading your book. So I couldn't be happier. And then what was the other question? I'm sorry.
Well, I'll come back to it, but just to follow up the Barnes & Noble part of it, since it's a Barnes & Noble conversation. What did it mean to you to have your book chosen for this program?
It just, as much as anything else, I think I felt that this meant giving another voice to the book, and of course, I'm a lover of bookstores, so, it's a real honor. So
it's just such a nice platform. It's a wonderful platform. That's what I found.
Yeah.
So my question was really about this journey that you've been on. The years it took to write the book, and the fact that you started writing, as you say, when you were in your mid-20s. So between your mid-20s and then starting this book, what were you working on?
Okay. I just got the beep that my battery is about to die. So poor planning. I'm going to plug in the computer. So.
All right. Well, while you're doing that, I'm going to tell people that for me, the Barnes & Noble Discover Award was kind of like in The Wizard of Oz when they give, courage to the lion, because it made me feel, I think I was 29. I have a different path. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know what people would think of the book. And it just made me feel like a writer, I think.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've put it so much better than I did, but yeah, absolutely. So.
Okay. So sorry, but back to what were you writing before you wrote this book? Did you try other novels? Do you have novels of yours?
Oh goodness, yes. I have a whole drawer full of failed projects. And I wrote a lot of short stories. I am the short story form in a lot of ways is the form I'm most comfortable with, and I think you can see that in the book. The way a lot of the chapters have a nice sort of full arc in and of themselves. But honestly, I was a person who had to do a fair amount of living before I was ready to write. And I've always written as I've also worked, and raised my kid. I think, until very recently, the only time I really wrote full time was for 2 years of graduate school. And the rest of the time I was, always kind of squeezing writing in around the edges. But also I'm just terribly slow. I am truly one of those writers who could spend a whole morning working on a single paragraph and then throw it out and start all over the next day. I read aloud constantly. I will never be one of those people working in a coffee shop because I have to read everything aloud. And so I'm just slow, honestly. And it took me a long time, like I said, to be able to see these characters. So when I say I worked on the book for about 14 years, that's a little misleading because there were days and weeks and months and even a couple of years when I took long breaks from it, either because I was earning a living or caring for my kid or both. Or frankly, because I lost my nerve. And during those times, I would go and work on other things. It was so important to me to get this book right.
Mm-hmm. I saw a quote from an artist. It was 7 rules for, I love those, rules that will teach you how to be an artist. New York Times this week, he was a visual artist, but one of his rules was quit and come back. His point was don't work something into the ground. When you come back, you often have a fresh eye. And I find that for myself, but to your point of sort of putting it aside and coming back to it, I can completely see what you're saying. So did this novel take shape? Did it begin? One of the things I love about it is that it feels a little bit like Olive Kittredge. It almost has a short story feel as you go through. And so I was wondering what the process of writing it was like, meaning, did you go through many drafts? Did you think of any of them as stories individually first? What was it like?
Yeah, indeed. And as a matter of fact, the book began as a short story that was actually published. And I think it was in the Colorado Review. And then what I discovered was that I kept coming back to that moment and those characters and wanting to sort of talk about them more. But yeah, I carried the book through probably, oh gosh, I mean, it's hard to say, but it's maybe 7 or 8 drafts, and they were major revisions. I mean, for example, at one point, the story spanned 11 years. It began in, February of 1976 and went to 1987. So 11 years, and then I took it through several drafts like that, actually. And then I went in and plucked out 25 pages and started over. I mean, the good news is I have a ton of material in my drawer because they were fully fleshed out drafts. I mean, they were, chapters and scenes and plot and arc and the whole thing. And I just took this 25 pages and plucked that out and then went with that, and that was, I mean, I was well into, probably my 8th or 9th year when I did that. So, so that was a radical change. When I revise, I'm not kidding around.
Yeah. Well, ruthlessness is what I mean. I always tell when I teach, I always tell my students that being able to ruthlessly edit yourself is going to make the difference between publishing and not publishing. So when you did then look for an agent, or maybe you already had one, I don't know, did you do even more revision before you submitted it?
I did. And I, in terms of the publishing part, it may have taken me forever to write the book, but in terms of the publishing part, I was very, very fortunate. My agent found me because of a short story she had seen, I think, in maybe the Kenyon Review or something. And so, she reached out to me. So I was very, very lucky in that regard. And then we worked together, on the book. I let her see some drafts and she offered her advice. And then, of course, when the book sold, and again, I again, I got very, very lucky on the selling of the book. It happened pretty quickly. But then, of course, I worked with the editor, for my amazing editor, Emily Griffin, who is brilliant. And honestly, I can't imagine how the book would be different without her hand in there. I mean, it was really, I know we have this kind of mythology of the writer going into their room and writing a book. But for me, I mean, this book was very much the product of a lot of love and a lot of feedback and a lot of effort. So she was great. And we worked on after the book sold, I think I dawdled on editing. So like I really dawdled, and honestly, if she hadn't eventually sent me an email saying we're done, we're going to the printer, I would probably still be tinkering with this book. So she was great. She knew just where to push and when to push. And she also knew when to say, let's leave it, so.
I think that's true about writing books, that you always could go back and edit more. I just finished a novel that's coming out in September, and the same thing. If my editor hadn't grabbed it out of my hands, I would probably be editing it for sure. Right. You were talking at one point about how we both write longhand first, at least in some parts. I write all my drafts longhand to begin with. And then as I type them in, I edit. What is your process like? I mean, in that way, do you have any rituals or favorite places that you work? Is there any rhyme or reason to your methodology?
I work where I am able to work, and I have rituals that work for me for just as long as they work for me. And the minute they stop, I get something else. I've become very flexible over the years. I think that's partly a function of not being a full-time writer, for many years when Hank, my son, was little, I worked at home doing freelance copy editing, so I was writing, after he went to bed at night or whenever he napped, which was never. He was not a napper from the get-go. So for me, my rituals are, to find a quiet place, and do my best. And the moment that place stops working for me, to find another quiet place. I don't write my drafts in longhand. I should be clear on that. I will start things in longhand, and then once I've kind of got the feel of it and the rhythm of the story and the voices, then I'll go ahead and switch to my laptop. So if you looked at any of my journals, you would see a lot of starts, but no completely handwritten drafts. So.
Do you have do you write down sort of impressions or moments, just because your book has the language is so beautifully observed, meaning sunsets and the feel of the landscape and the topography, the kinds of houses people live in. I just wondered if you did those, if you just sit down and write and all of that comes to you at once, or if you kind of notice what you notice as you go.
Yeah, I take notes constantly. I always have my journal with me, always. I'm one of those people who chooses bags based on whether or not it will fit my journals, And I left home at 18, but I have family back there, and I go back as often as I can. And so it's been many years now. And every time I would go back to Texas, I would make sure that I took some long drives in the desert and out through the oil patch, in part because I love long drives, and my life in Chicago doesn't always lend itself to long drives. And in part, I think what happened for me was that I fell in love with the land first, and that was my entry into the book. And that was also my entry into falling back in love with my hometown. I think when you live in a city, as I have for a very long time, quiet spaces, open spaces, stars, birds and little critters, can become so much more valuable to you maybe than they were before. And so I think it was kind of a function of those long drives through the desert, but also living somewhere where I really came to appreciate and love those open spaces. So.
Right, exactly. So we've talked about how, this long journey that you went on to write this novel. And I wonder if there's advice that you have for people who are aspiring writers. Encouragement.
I have tons of advice. I think the first thing I would say to writers is you're not alone. I think that it can be very easy to feel alone, and again to think of ourselves as sort of in our rooms alone writing. But in fact, my book would not exist without the love and faith of a ton of friends, and teachers, and advisors and people who believed in me and pushed me on. Because when you work on a book for 14 years, I mean, there are definitely moments where you want to just give up. Um, and I also would say that, you're not on someone else's schedule. I think it can be very easy to sort of see, writing, and particularly in the US, as, a kind of college MFA program book deal. That was not my trajectory at all. I didn't even go to college until I was in my 20s. And then I started going to community college in LA while I waited tables. So my trajectory is very different from a lot of people's. And I think it can be very easy to feel as if, you hit 30, no book, 35, no book, 45, no book. And to say, this dream is, these doors have slammed closed. And in fact, I think particularly for working class writers or writers who are taking care of children or parents, it can become really easy to become disheartened. So I would say, you're not on anyone else's trajectory. Some of us just can't pull off that schedule and that timeline. And for me too, living was very much a crucial part of what was required for me to become a writer. I needed to spend some time out in the world outside of Texas, before I was ready to tell any stories. And then, of course, I guess the other thing I would say is ask for help. This book exists because of friends and family who supported me in practical as well as, emotional ways. I got a couple of grants. I was very lucky. I got an NEA the year my son was 2. And every bit of that money went to childcare. And I got a draft that year. One of the earliest drafts was finished, the year that I got the NEA. So I was very lucky. And then more importantly, in some ways, for the last few years that I worked on this book, my husband took on a second job, so that I could work as little freelance as possible. And so for several years, he taught high school English all day long and then went and tutored at night, so that I could take on as little freelance as possible. And this book wouldn't exist without that sacrifice. And I think it can be very hard to ask the people who love us for sacrifice on our behalf. For men and women, I think in a lot of ways, I think it's harder for women to ask their loved ones to sacrifice for their creative projects. So if anything, I wish I'd asked a little earlier.
Yeah.
And I come from a place where, people would literally rather die than ask for help. So I get it. But, so I guess that would be my advice.
That's such great advice. I could actually ask you 1,000 more questions about that advice. But it's time to take some questions from the audience. So how long have you been an author since? Not sure.
Well, like I said, I think I wrote my first complete short story when I was in my mid to late 20s. And again, I was waiting tables then. I think recently someone asked me about my waitressing career and I had to sit down and put the pen to paper. I think I've waited tables for a grand total of about 12 or 13 years of my life. So even when I began writing, even before I had my son, writing was always something that I did before or after work. So I guess, I don't know if, when you count yourself as an author, does that count when your first book is published or your first story is published or you write your first story or I don't
know. Feel like an author? When did it?
Oh, I guess what I would say is that writing is so visceral for me that when I'm sitting down and writing is when I feel like a writer. When I'm actually doing the work is when I feel like a writer. When I finish something, I feel like a writer. There's nothing in the world. I think maybe having my son is about the only thing that can compare to the feeling of finishing a story or a book. So I guess that would be.
It is a birth. The book. It feels like you're giving birth to a creative product. And in fact, I had a friend in grad school who said he would never have children because his creative product was his child. That really felt that way about it. And for myself, just in answer to that question, I feel like a writer when I sit down and write, but I didn't like an author until I had published. I think that's sort of the difference for me.
Yeah.
So I've got some more questions here. So what authors inspired you early on?
Oh gosh, a lot. Marilyn Robinson's work has been incredibly important to me. Luis Alberto Urrea's work has been very important to me. Chris Offutt, and I'm actually naming some teachers I've had too. Chris Offutt's work meant a lot to me. He was the writer who introduced me to Brees DJ Pancake, and who had one book out before he died pretty tragically. And his short stories were set in the mining towns of West Virginia. And I think for me, it was one of the first times I really understood in a real clear way that the stuff of people's ordinary lives, people on the margins, was the stuff of literature too. So that was incredibly pivotal to me. Paulette Giles, a Texas writer, has been huge for me. I reread her books constantly, often for research as much as anything else. And then again, some poetry. I mean, this is going way back, but the work of Toni Morrison really changed my life. And I did not know anything about her growing up in West Texas when I did until I was in my 20s. And Beloved was a revelation for me. And not just because it was so incredibly beautiful, but because it showed me, as a young white girl growing up in a deeply segregated town that's pretty geographically isolated, these were not, questions of race were not questions that I had any real understanding of, at all. And that was not until my 20s that I really started to read Toni Morrison. James Baldwin. You get those questions like if you could sit down with any writer and have dinner, I think James Baldwin might be one of those writers for me. Grace Paley was huge for me. Oh gosh, I know I'm forgetting so many people.
As you're going through these writers, I can almost feel them in your book. I just reread Beloved, as many people did when Toni Morrison died, and that sort of complexity of her lyricism, that almost magic realism that she has. Well, it is. Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. Here's another question. Did any of your characters come to you fully formed?
No, nothing comes to me fully formed. I have to figure it all out on the page. I will start with a voice and then I'm discovering everything along the way. I can tell you which character was the most surprising to me. And that was Corinne Shepherd, because I had always imagined her as a very minor character. I never imagined that she would have her own point of view in the book. And she ends up having, 3 chapters that are hers. I imagine that she would be the sort of, feisty neighbor, I guess, who occasionally walked across the street and delivered news that would sort of advance my plot. And so she was a surprise to me. But no, I don't think any character ever comes to me fully formed. I really have to spend the time on the page to figure out who these people are and what's motivating them and what they fear and what they love and what their sorrows are, And I do draw from people in my life and of course my own, experiences, for sure. But with the characters, they're always amalgamations.
I always think of that line from, I think, is it Picasso? Inspiration exists, but it has to find you working. And so what you're saying is that not that they come to you fully formed, but that once they're there, they go in directions that you don't expect. And that's, I think, one of the joys of writing a novel. Okay, I have one more question here. So have you been able to put your characters to rest now that the book has been published?
No. I have not. And I'm already starting to imagine another book set in West Texas, a few years after this book. So it's so funny because when I left home, I thought I would never write about that place or I would never have fully realized fictional characters set there. And now that I've begun doing it, I don't know if I'll ever write anywhere else. I've been in Chicago for 18 years. I've never said a single story set in Chicago. I have an entire collection of stories set in Phoenix, Arizona that I mean, they're done, and many of them have been published, but I'm like, I don't know if I'll ever write anything ever set anywhere else for the rest of my life. I'm deeply in love now with my home state and my hometown.
You're like Faulkner for Texas. You've got your landscape.
Yeah.
How exciting. The passion even that you talk about that, it makes me want to read the next Texas book from Elizabeth Wetmore, I have to say. Okay, so we have one more question.
Okay.
Stephanie, which is, why do you think that books are what we need during challenging time?
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you, Stephanie. That's a great question. I firmly believe that books have saved my life more than once. As a kid growing up in Texas, books were the way I saw that the world was so much bigger than I could ever have imagined. But they've also shown me, that it's possible to be heroic in ways you could never imagine. I'm very interested in characters who don't see themselves as heroic, who don't maybe have a lot of resources or a lot of money or a lot of education. And yet when the time calls for it, they are able to step up and act in heroic ways. And of course, if ever there were a time that called for heroism, right, now is that. And of course, we have the obvious heroism of, watching medical workers, save lives, or people in grocery stores, stocking the shelves and delivering groceries so that people can stay fed. People working in plants to keep the food supply flowing, farmers, and those are obvious heroes. But there are also people whose sort of quiet acts of heroism are just being kind to each other, or standing up for the things that you believe in, even if you have to stand up to the people you love. So I guess that's, and then of course there's just comfort and escape, and this kind of, the sort of, the presence of beauty in your life, so.
Right. Well, Elizabeth, I would say, there was an article today about how people are drawn actually to books that are complicated during this. It's almost like you want to work through, and your book is complicated. It's you deal with heavy subjects. You're really talking about human emotion and the depth of human experience. And I think it's the perfect book for this moment, for people to be pulled into a story that's not their own, but is somehow reflects or elucidates what's going on in the world. And I want to thank you so much for doing this tonight. It's been such an honor and a pleasure to talk to you.
Christina, thank you. You've had such great questions, as have people who have sort of written in. So thank you. It's been an honor to be here, and I'm so delighted to be part of this Barnes and Noble project, and it's really been an honor. So thank you.
Me too. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Good night. Good night, everybody.